Well, hello there, and welcome to the Randy Cross podcast. Appreciate you joining us. Got a pretty good show for you. We've been away for a while, but we are now back. We'll explain why in later episodes, but we're going to get right at it. Joining me today is Phil Steele. Now, if that name sounds familiar, you've probably seen this on the newsstands. It's a Phil Steele Guide, College Football 2019 preview. This is the Bible for people in college football, especially people in college football that have to talk about college football or that want to know all there is to know about college football. And joining me right now is Phil Steele. Phil, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Randy. Pleasure being on.
Yeah, it's excitement is in the air. They've started the usual meaningless preseason games on the NFL side, and college football is practicing and getting ready for their games. I mean, we get ramped up next Thursday on the 24th. I just can't wait. You've got to be really excited.
Yeah, I talk about, I'd say during the summer, I probably do 300 or so radio shows and talking about football. It's always a lot more fun when the games are actually being played, Randy.
Absolutely. Hey, if you don't mind, I'd love to go through the major conferences and get your thoughts on what we're going to see this year. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start out with my old conference. Well, we can't do my old conference. That was the Pac-8. But nowadays, it's called the Pac-12. And what are you seeing out there? Is there anybody in the South that's going to give Oregon and Washington a run?
Yeah, I think there is this year, Randy. And, I'll tell you this. The Pac-12, if you read the front of the magazine where I rank the conferences, naturally I've had the Pac-12 rated as the fifth best conference each of the last 2 years, and they deserve to be down there at that number 5 level. But this year I'm optimistic about the Pac-12. I actually have them rated the third best conference. I like what they have coming back. Starting in the North, I think that Washington's got the best schedule in the North, but to me, Oregon looks to be the best team. They've got my number 1 rated offensive line in the country, 153 career starts returning, may have the quarterback that gets picked number 1 in the NFL draft this year in Justin Herbert. They added in a player like Kayvon Thibodeau, the number 1 rated defensive lineman out of high school, the team with Jordan Scott up front. They've got Trey Dye back for what seems like his 10th year at linebacker there. And they've got excellent cornerbacks with Thomas Graham and Lenore. So this is a very good Oregon team. Now, they're going to have to learn how to win on the road, and that's going to be the key this year. They're 4-12 on the road the last 3 years or away from Autzen Stadium. And they do have to play Stanford, Washington, USC, and Arizona State on the road. But I think their talent level would have them winning the North this year with Washington having the best schedule. When I look at the South, I like the Utah Utes this year. And it's rare for me to put a Pac-12 team as my number 1 rated defensive line in the country. But that's where I've got Utah. Bradley Anae, Penasini, Fotu, they go about 11 deep on the D-line, which is what you like, and they've got 6 or 7 guys there that are NFL caliber. They've got a legitimate shutdown corner in Jalen Johnson. And remember last year with Utah, they lost their starting quarterback, Tyler Huntley, and they also lost their star running back, Zach Moss, both with about 5 games to go in the season. And they still made it to the Pac-12 title game and still nearly knocked off Washington in that game. Well, Huntley's back. Moss is back. The receiving corps looks to be one of the best that Whittingham's put on the field. The offensive line is a veteran enough group. And Oregon and Stanford both drop off the schedule this year. They had to play the top 4 teams in the North last year. No Oregon, no Stanford. 2 toughest road games are at USC, a team that had a 27-10 first down edge last year, and at Washington, a team that's only got 2 returning starters on defense. So actually this year, Randy, I'm calling Utah my number 1 surprise team in the country. And a surprise team is a non-top 10 team that I think can make the playoff. Last year, my number 1 surprise team was the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. They weren't in the top 10 at the start of the year. Lo and behold, they made the playoff at the end of the year. So I think if any Pac-12 team is going to make the playoff this year, I'm going out on the limb here with the Utah Utes.
That's going to be fun to watch. I guarantee you that. It's going to be exciting. I think it's a football team for kind of football heads, only because so much of what they do that's really attractive is at the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. They're really, really solid.
Yeah, absolutely. I love teams that are strong at the line of scrimmage, and Utah's always there. Another area that Utah's always good, special teams. Kyle Whittingham does a tremendous job there. They're always in my top 25 every single year, and they'll be up there again this year, despite the fact they lose both their kicker and their punter. Whittingham's going to find the replacements.
Now, you think there's anything to that 9 a.m. kickoff thing?
I think that would be highly unusual to start having games at 9 o'clock in the morning. I think you're going to have half-filled stadiums if that happens. So hopefully it doesn't. And play the games at 12:30. Compete against the 3:30 games.
I love it. Let's move along. Go a little east here, and go to the conference that includes Oklahoma and Texas and sort of the other guys, the Big 12.
Yeah, and, Oklahoma and Texas, I could point out some flaws where I think that the Big 12 is wide enough open this year that some other teams could very well step in. And remember last year, Iowa State nearly made the Big 12 title game. They lost that late game against Texas. West Virginia nearly made the Big 12 title game. They hosted Oklahoma. Had they won that game, they would have been in there. They lost by 3 in a tight 59-56 game. So the Big 12 was open last year, but it came down to Oklahoma and Texas, and those two are my favorites. When I look at Oklahoma, they'll have an improved defense. Let's face it, they can only improve on that side of the ball. They gave up 454 yards per game last year, 33.3 points per game, but they've got 7 starters back on D, should be better. Offensively, last year, Randy, when I was doing my radio show circuit, I felt really confident saying, hey, I like Kyler Murray, but let's face it, he's not going to match Baker Mayfield's stats from last year. Baker Mayfield won the Heisman, for crying out loud. Then Lincoln Riley goes and makes me a liar because all of a sudden Kyler Murray not only matched him, probably exceeded him last year. I am not going to say Jalen Hurts can't put up those kind of numbers with the quarterback whisperer, Lincoln Riley there. They've got some pretty good receivers led by CeeDee Lamb. The running back core is solid. Oklahoma is not going to have a weak offensive line, but it's not going to be last year's offensive line. When I talked to Lincoln Riley in the spring going over the team with them, he said last year's offensive line, the Joe Moore Award winner, by the way, might be the type that comes around once every 20 years. They only have one starter back up front, Creed Humphrey. Probably my biggest question mark on the team will be how close will that offensive line be to last year's. But Oklahoma will probably be favored in all their games. The offensive line and not a top 10 defense leaves the door open. And with Texas, they only have 3 starters back on defense, Randy, but I like the fact that they've been recruiting extremely well under Tom Herman. There's no doubt that athletically this defense is better than what they've been putting on the field. And if they can come around quickly and get through some early games like LSU and Oklahoma State, that Oklahoma game could very well determine it. Love Sam Ehlinger. Offensive line looks solid. Keontae Ingram, I think, is poised for a breakout year. Colin Johnson and Duvernay, a wide receiver, are dangerous. Those are my top 2 teams. But here's the main contenders. TCU Horned Frogs. And Gary Patterson always has a bounce-back year. I went 4-8 in 2013. The next year, they almost made the playoff at 12-1. In fact, they were ranked highly and blew out Iowa State in the final game, 55-3, but dropped from number 4 to number 6 in the playoff poll and just missed out. A couple of years ago, they were coming off a 6-7 season, went 11-3, got as high as number 4 in the country, and they were probably the most beat-up team in college football last year. They had the most starts lost to injury, down to a 3rd or 4th string quarterback, had 1 healthy scholarship running back available. They're in a lot better shape this year. Ross Blacklock, probably their top defensive player, missed all of last year with injury, is back. I think TCU is going to be a threat this year. And then Iowa State, got to hand it to Matt Campbell. You look at the last 2 years, from 1979 to 2016, Iowa State had a grand total of 1 year where they won 8 games or more. Matt Campbell's done it in back-to-back years. I didn't call for it in either year, but I tell you what, they had one of the Big 12's best defenses last year. They've got 8 starters back on that side of the ball. Offensive line, when Campbell took over, his first offensive line was a mismatch. They had 0 returning starters. They had about 4 career starts coming back. They had walk-ons in there, converted defensive linemen, tight ends are in there. This year, they've got 5 returning starters up front. By far, his best offensive line. Brock Purdy was a revelation at quarterback last year. He's got some players to work with, including a couple of VHT or very highly touted running backs that they bring in true freshmen Breece Hall and Jarrell Brock. So this is an Iowa State team that is is one of only 3 teams in the country that has not lost by more than 14 points the last 2 years. And I think they're a legitimate contender as well. And the final one I'll throw out in the Big 12, Randy, is Baylor. And I'll go back to the conversation I had with Coach Rule last year as I'm hanging up the phone. Remember, Baylor's coming off a 1-11 season. Coach Rule goes, "We're going to make a bowl this year, Phil." And I'm like, "Oh, whatever." I didn't even put them on my most improved list. They were coming off a 1-11 season. They went 7-6, and this year I'm like, "Okay, Coach, what do you think?" And then he thinks they can be a contender, so I'm going to put them in that category. They got a lot coming back this year.
Is there any hope? I mean, one of the big news stories at the beginning of this calendar year was Les Miles was back in the coaching business, and he took the job at Kansas. Can the Kansas Jayhawks, can they be a consistently winning program? Is it all about just the coach?
I think he can get them there. It's not going to be a 1-year fix or even a 2-year fix. We're talking a 3 to 4 year fix. But remember what he did at Oklahoma State. And you got the big name in there. I think they can bring some talent in. Kansas has had success before. They had that 1 year they went to the Orange Bowl back in 2007. So I think he can get them back towards the top. But it's going to be a couple of years, Randy, before we're talking about Kansas in contention in the Big 12.
All right, let's move up to the Big Ten, formerly known as Ohio State, Michigan, and the other guys. And now with Penn State, I guess you've got to add at least a third team to that mix, right?
Yeah, it's in the last couple of years, it's been the Big Four in the Big Ten East with Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan State all getting big-time billing. And, Randy, this is one of those conferences where the last 11 years, I have picked Ohio State higher than Michigan. I know a lot of folks out there have been calling for Michigan to win the Big Ten the last couple of years under Harbaugh. I haven't been one of them. 11 straight years I picked Ohio State over Michigan. I've been right in 10 of those years, so that's a pretty good track record. The 1 year I was not correct. I went with an interim head coach, which sort of threw everything into the thing. But this year, I like Michigan. And it's the first year I've called for Michigan to do it, and I think they're the best team in the Big Ten. Don Brown always got a great defense. Remember 2 years ago, he only had one returning starter on defense. Everybody wondered how they'd be. 18.8 points per game, under 300 yards per game. This year he's got 5 starters back on D. They'll have a legitimate top 10 D. Really like the addition of Josh Gaddis as the offensive coordinator coming in from Alabama. He's bringing in the spread offense, which is the perfect fit for Shea Patterson. And you're going to see the quarterback run a lot more with Michigan this year, and they're deep enough at quarterback where it doesn't matter. Dylan McCaffrey, Joe Milton, Cade McNamara, those are all guys I have confidence in. So even if a quarterback was to go down, they're very deep at that position. I was recently doing the Football Writers Association Outland Award preseason list for helping on that. And there's 4 Michigan offensive linemen I could have put on the list. Cesar Ruiz, Onwenu, Bredesen, Runyon, all those guys could have made the list. So that's a very good offensive line. I rate number 4 in the country. Special teams are solid, and their toughest 3 opponents, Notre Dame, Michigan State, Ohio State, they get them all at home in Ann Arbor. I think this is finally the year Michigan breaks through. And it's the first time in 12 years I've called for them to top Ohio State. Ohio State, the question marks would be new head coach. You lose a Hall of Fame head coach in Urban Meyer. You lose Dwayne Haskins in his 50 touchdown passes. The 2 things I think you'll see change most for Ohio State this year, better run game with Justin Fields at quarterback, better defense. I mean, last year's defense was the second worst all-time in Ohio State history, giving up 403 yards per game. They've got 9 starters back on that side of the ball. And they've owned Michigan, and Big Ten East could very well come down to that final game of the season when they play at Michigan on the road. I think Michigan State with 17 returning starters, most experienced team in the league. Their offense was so banged up last year. The offense will be better, and defensively, they may have the best defense in college football. It's one of the top 3 for sure, especially with Willikis back at DE and Bocce back at linebacker. Penn State, they also have an excellent defense, and their biggest question mark is going to be a quarterback. They're breaking in a new one, losing McSorley, and I had thought that Tommy Stevens was going to be the starting quarterback for Penn State. Mm-hmm. Well, he's a starting quarterback for Mississippi State this year. That's probably my biggest question mark on the team for Penn State. And the one team I'm going to talk about out of the West, I will say the West is wide open. Any one of 6 teams can win the West. But my number 1 most improved team in the country this year is the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And Nebraska was just 4-8 last year. But remember, Scott Frost stepped into a tough situation. He was replacing a pass-happy offense under Mike Riley. They had to retool the offensive line to get them to learn the new blocking schemes. They had to bring in a brand-new system on offense, and it took time. The first 6 games last year, they only averaged 23 points per game. But over the last 6 games, 37 points per game. In fact, they went 0-6 in the first 6. They went 4-2 in the last 6. And in those games, their losses were by 3 and 5 points. The 5-point loss in Columbus. This year, the offensive line, the entire offense is now in the second year. Adrian Martinez, one of the best quarterbacks in the country. I think he's a perfect fit for that system. Defensively, they'll be stronger with 6 starters back. And then the schedule. Michigan and Michigan State drop off the schedule. They're get their toughest 3 opponents in the West, Iowa, Northwestern, and Wisconsin, all at home. I could see Nebraska making the jump from 4 wins all the way up to double digits this year. They're my pick to win the Big Ten West. And last year, my number 1 most improved team was Florida. Florida went from being 4-7 in 2017 all the way up to number 7 in the final polls.
All right. That's one quick question about a Big Ten team. Can Wisconsin finally get Taylor a little help? We know he's going to run for a gazillion yards, but can they get just a little bit of a passing game to go with him?
Yeah, and wasn't that the quietest 2,000-yard season you've ever seen?
Crazy.
Last year. I mean, nobody even talked about Jonathan Taylor, yet he put together 2,194 yards.
4,100 yards in the last 2 years.
Yeah, it's amazing, and no one talked about him last year. And I think that I'm going with a true freshman to start a quarterback for him, and Graham Mertz. Now, Wisconsin normally does not bring in what I call a VHT quarterback, or very highly touted. Mertz was my number 4 rated quarterback coming out of high school, so he's a rare QB for there. If he can adapt quickly as a true freshman, then I think he can give him that pass game. They're going to need to rebuild offensive line to help him out a little bit, too. Biadasz, the only returning starter up front. They, like Oklahoma, or just like Oklahoma, lose the bulk of their offensive line with only 1 starter back. So that would be my biggest question mark, would be the offensive line with Wisconsin as to whether or not they could get some help for Taylor.
That's great. Hey, let's move over to the site of the national champion, the ACC. I don't know how many people realize the number of bowl teams that came out of the ACC and how many winning records there were in that conference. I mean, the quality of football is definitely on the rise, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think Clemson is bringing it up. And for the ACC, they need teams like Florida State, Miami of Florida to get their game back on track as well, to really get the conference going up. Now, I'll say this. Clemson is the prohibitive favorite to win the ACC this year. They are going to be at least a 17-point favorite in every single one of their games. Offensively, maybe the most explosive offense in the country. I mean, Trevor Lawrence would have been the first pick in the draft had he been able to come out after his true freshman season. NTN, a running back, they've got a dangerous receiving core, which I rate number 2 in the country. The offensive line is a veteran group. I rate number 3 in the country. That's an explosive offense. And defensively, while they lose 3 number 1 draft picks and a number 3 DC off that defensive line, I still rate them the number 5 defensive line in the country. They're solid at linebacker and defensive back. It's a loaded Clemson team, and like I said, they'll be at least a 17-point favorite in every single game. I don't really see anybody in the Atlantic challenging them this year, but I do think Florida State will be an improved squad. Florida State has made my most improved list. They haven't had a losing season since 1976. Willie Taggart now in his second year. He says the team is completely bought in this year after a lot of question marks last year. The depth is better. I think you're going to see one of the sneakily better defenses in college football with Florida State this year. Watch that unit as the season progresses. And Syracuse is one team just to keep an eye on. They get Clemson at home. Remember last year they went into Clemson as a 4-touchdown underdog, led by 2 scores in the fourth quarter. Clemson needed their third-string quarterback to complete a 4th and 10 pass, keep the drive alive. Had Clemson lost that game, they would have tied Syracuse in the standings. Clemson wouldn't even have made the ACC title game. Syracuse would have been in the title game. Clemson might have missed the playoff. So they're always a little tricky with Dino Babers. And then you look at the Coastal, and as always, the Coastal wide open. They've had 6 different winners the last 6 years. The only team that hasn't won the Coastal recently, Virginia. So it's Virginia's turn, right? Well, I went with Miami of Florida. And when I look at Miami, while they have a new head coach, it's Manny Diaz, who's been there 4 years. The problem with Miami has not been the defense. They've had a top 10 defense. They've got a top 10 defense again this year. The entire linebacking core is back. Offensively, that's been the question mark. Now, Dan Enos comes in. And when I talked to Coach Diaz and went over the team this spring, he's extremely high that Dan Enos is going to get this offense rolling. Remember last year, They only completed about 50% of their passes offensively. They had 14 interceptions. I think both those numbers improve, even with the redshirt freshman Jaron Williams taking over at that capacity. So I think with just even an average offense, Miami's a big-time threat, and they've got the schedule, too. They're going to take on my number 69 schedule in the country, extremely low for Power 5. They go on the road September 7th against North Carolina, the start of September. They don't go on the road again until October 26th, at the very end of October. It's a schedule tailor-made for success. I've got them winning the Coastal, and they are my number 2 surprise team in the country. Also worth talking about, though, Bud Foster in his final year at Virginia Tech. When I was going over the defense with Coach Foster last year, it got to the end of the conversation. I go, Coach, every coach in the country says they're young. You're young on defense. They were freshmen, sophomores, inexperienced. And the one thing we agreed on was he couldn't afford to lose any frontline players. Then they lost 5 of them by the second week of the season. What happened? A very atypical Virginia Tech defense last year. They gave up 439 yards per game, 31 points per game. This year, 10 starters are back. It's going to be more of a Bud Foster defense. It's his final year. I think if anybody knocks off Miami and the Coastal, Virginia Tech and that defense are really going to be vastly improved this year.
All right. How about the AC? How about the SEC? That's going to be a conference that seems, I guess, form is one way to say it, but there are some lookout teams. You talked about Tommy Stevens. That Mississippi State team, Joe Moorhead is getting ready to build himself something pretty special.
Yeah, and if you look at my top 10 teams in the power poll in the front of the magazine, I've got Alabama there. I've got LSU there. I've got Texas A&M there. I've got Auburn there. I've got Georgia there, and I've got Florida there. So that is 6 teams in my top 10 in the front of the magazine. I do rate the SEC the toughest conference in college football. Now, I'm going out on a limb here in the West, Randy. I'm going to take Alabama to win the West this year. How about that?
Okay, there you go. It's a pretty thick limb.
Yeah. When you take a look at Alabama, I talked about Clemson's offense. Alabama's offense right there. If it's not Clemson going to be number 1 offense this year, it will be Alabama. Tua Tagovailoa at QB, Najee Harris at running back. You look at receiving court, it's the best in the country. And offensive line, veteran group that I rate number 6 in the country, they are loaded. And defensively, remember last year, they only had 3 returning starters on defense. Well, this year they have 6 returning starters coming back. So they're going to be better than last year's defense. Special teams are solid. Alabama will be a double-digit favorite in every game. Now, their toughest 2 games, at Texas A&M in College Station and then at Auburn in Jordan-Hare Stadium. Those are going to be their toughest 2. They do also have to play Mississippi State on the road. I think if anybody in the West is going to knock off Alabama this year, I'm going with LSU. And with LSU, you're talking about a team that last year was probably the least experienced, or I think they were number 129 on my chart experience-wise, and they played a killer schedule. And I said during the offseason they could be an underdog in 5 or 6 games last year. And guess what? They were an underdog in 5 games. Still went 10-3. One of their losses was actually in 7 overtime to Texas A&M, a game they thought they won, or they would have been an 11-2 team last year. Now, Joe Burrow didn't join the team until after summertime last year. So they were very conservative with him early. But over the last 3 games, they took the reins off. He had a 9-1 ratio. That's 9 touchdowns, 1 interception. And Burrow now is going to be in the spread offense. I think you're going to see him be a vastly improved QB. Defensively, they got 9 starters back on that side of the ball, or 8 starters back this year. So they're going to be up there. And then you look at their schedule. Unlike last year, the schedule is much more favorable. In fact, they're only going to be an underdog in 1 game this year, Randy, and that's at Alabama. And I think LSU feels they can play with Bama. Remember the last time they traveled there, they actually outgained Alabama in Tuscaloosa. So I think if anybody's going to knock off the Tide this year, it's LSU. Now, Texas A&M and Auburn, I mentioned our top 10 teams talent-wise. But unbelievable schedules. I mean, I think the top 4 teams in the country in my power poll this year are Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, and LSU. Guess what? Texas A&M takes on all 4 of those teams this year. Clemson, Alabama, Georgia, and LSU. And 3 of them are on the road. At Clemson, they play at Georgia between the hedges. The very next week they have to go to at Death Valley and face LSU. Now, when I talked to Coach Fisher and was going over the team with him this year, I said, Coach, I think I'm going to put you on my national cover, which is a team that makes the playoff. And then I said next year, because this year's schedule is a little too tough. I like the Aggies, but too tough a schedule. And same thing with Auburn. Auburn's got my number 2 rated defensive line in the country this year. You look at them offensively. You talk about teams strong at the line of scrimmage, Randy. They got my number 5 rated offensive line. Solid on special teams, number 3. But their schedule's brutal. At Texas A&M, at Florida, at LSU. They'll be an underdog in all 3 of those games. Home to Georgia, home to Alabama, underdog in both games. And they open up with Oregon. So that's just a brutal schedule. And the reason I don't see Auburn or Texas A&M really contending in the West. And then I do like Mississippi State and Tommy Stevens. Here's an interesting story for you, Randy. The last 3 years when I've talked to James Franklin at Penn State, and I go over every position on the team and every player on the team with them. So we get to quarterback right at the start of the conversation. Talk about Trace McSorley. He's like, each year he says, Phil, we're 1 and 1A at quarterback. I'm just as comfortable with Tommy Stevens at quarterback as I am with Trace McSorley. Wow, that was a mind blower for me. And now Tommy Stevens is starting quarterback Mississippi State. When I talked to Moorhead, he said, want to get the passing game going? I think Stevens can do that. And defensively, while they lose all those guys off the defensive front 4, the linebacking core is back. So they're still going to be a very good team. In the East, I went with Georgia. Yeah. And, an interesting stat there. Georgia's lost the last 2 years to Alabama, but in those games, they've only trailed by a grand total of 1 minute and 4 seconds. I mean, that's amazing that they've either led or been tied against Bama all but a minute of the game for 2 years, but come up with 2 losses. And this year's Georgia team probably even better. 6 returning starters on offense, 6 on defense. I think Fromm is a sneaky Heisman candidate player, especially if they knock off Alabama in the SEC title game at the end of the year, right before the Heisman vote. I think Fromm would generate. Remember this past year, Kyler Murray stole the Heisman vote from Tua Tagovailoa late in the year.
Well, isn't the big story though, or question for Georgia? Who the heck is Fromm going to throw to?
Yeah, that is your question. Now, they lose their top 5 guys from last year, but I'm actually okay with the receiving core, Randy. Last year the top guy only had about 570 yards receiving. They got Demetrius Robinson, a Cal transfer. They've got guys like Lawrence Cager in Miami of Florida transfer, and they brought in some big-time recruits. I think with a veteran quarterback, with DeAndre Swift in the backfield, with an offensive line that's I rate them the number 2 offensive line in the country, and definitely a candidate for the Joe Moore Award. I think that you're going to see these receivers develop, and it wouldn't surprise me if the top 5 receivers for Georgia this year top the top 5 receivers from last year's stats. So I think they'll be okay at receiver. Defensively, I think they're a little bit stronger as well. Now, they've got a couple of games that concern me. One would be at Auburn when they play in Jordan-Hare. That's going to be a tough one. And then Florida and Jacksonville. Those would be the 2 toughest road games for them. Florida's a team which I really like what I saw out of Felipe Franks down the stretch last year. Remember, he lost his job basically against Missouri. They were going to start Trask against South Carolina. Trask got injured. They had to go with Franks. They were down big to South Carolina. Then he rallied them. And we saw a Dan Mullen quarterback. Franks started to run the ball, became much more efficient down the stretch, much more confident, and that makes Florida dangerous. Now, my biggest question mark with Florida is that offensive line. Only 1 returning starter up front. They take on some pretty good D-lines this year. Defensively, they're solid. They do lose their top sack man, their top tackler, their top interceptor, but they've got 8 starters back. They'll be good there. If a team in the East is going to knock off Georgia, it's probably Florida, and that game in Jacksonville decides it. And if you're looking for a sneaky team in the SEC this year, Randy, I'd have to say Missouri, and it's not necessarily because of the talent. I rate them number 25 in the country coming in, but it's the schedule. They open up with at Wyoming. They'll be favored. Home to West Virginia. West Virginia's in a rebuilding mode. They'll be favored. Southeast Missouri, favored. They almost knocked off South Carolina on the road last year. They get them at home. They'll be favored. Troy at home, favored. Mississippi at home, favored. At Vanderbilt, very well could be favored. At Kentucky, very well could be favored. Kentucky lost a lot from last year. There's a chance Missouri could be 8-0 when they face Georgia. And if you watch last year's game against Georgia, they played very well at the line of scrimmage. In fact, they had a 26-18 first down edge in that game. Gave up a couple of return touchdowns, which is the reason they lost by 14. So I'm not enamored with the talent Missouri has, but I am enamored with the schedule. And I think if you're looking for this year's Kentucky or a surprise team in the East, it would be the Missouri Tigers.
All right. In the group of 5, do you think there's a team in there kind of like a la UCF that has a chance to consistently at least be an irritant or aggravating to the Power Boys?
I think no. This year I don't see a group of 5 team running the table. which is surprising because normally we do have an undefeated Group of 5 team at the end of the year. I think of UCF, if it gets to be the start of October, on October the 5th, if UCF is undefeated, they will be that team again. But they just would have played 3 really tough games. Stanford at home, at Pitt, and then at Cincinnati. And Cincinnati's a scary team that won 11 games last year. If they get through that, Randy, and it's October the 5th and UCF's undefeated, then my answer would be yes, it's UCF. But I think Cincinnati may even beat them out in the East this year. They get that big game at home. And believe it or not, UCF's win total in Vegas right now is just 9. This from a team that's won 12 games each of the last 2 regular seasons. The team with the best shot at going unbeaten, and it's partially due to the schedule, is Memphis. Memphis takes on my number 111 schedule this year. They've got a veteran quarterback in Brady White. John Pop Williams, a dangerous running back / receiver at the slot position. Patrick Taylor, a running back. And the defense is going to be improved this year. And you look at their road schedule, at South Alabama, at ULM, at Temple, at Tulsa. At Houston's probably the toughest one. Then at USF, they've got a chance to be unbeaten at the end of the year, but I think they probably slip up somewhere along the way. A couple other teams to look at. Boise's going to be dangerous in the Mountain West. They open up with at Florida State, where I think they come up with a loss. Army is a team that could potentially run the table, but Army opens up with Michigan early in the season, and I think Don Brown's defense will do a good job containing the option. So I don't think a Group of 5 team jumps up there and is really aggravating the FBS folks this year.
All right, great. Hey, really appreciate you joining me, Phil. This has been fantastic. I think we're all a little bit smarter and ready for college football. Thanks again.
Always enjoy our conversations, Randy. Looking forward to the football season, my friend.
Me too, Phil. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much to Phil Steele again. As they say, Phil can go. That's a lot of information. And just get one of these, and it's full of amazing. That's good luck reading this. You see that? That's just one team. That is just on Texas Tech. Phil's got a wealth of information if you're a college football fan. So thank you to him, and I hope you all enjoyed that. Time now for our feel-good story of the week.
This is the good news. This is the good news.
Yeah, this real feel-good story is pretty simple. It's not complicated. It's about family. It's about discipline. It's about just a great relationship. And check this out. You'll love this story.
Oh my God.
Staff Sergeant Williams, West Division, man, the Huntleys granddaughter, Second Lieutenant Charlie Williams.
Commissioner Granton.
And in case you didn't get it from the very beginning, he was a staff sergeant. He was a former Marine. That's just great stuff. And she had just been commissioned as a second lieutenant. So there's thousands of those going on around the country every day. They don't always get on video, but that's a special one to remember. Hey, want to remind you, because it's been a while, where you find this Randy Cross podcast. You can Twitter, Facebook, all the usual places, iTunes. Just, you can find us all over the place, or just go to randycross.com. And any suggestions about stories or whatnot, that also is pretty simple. Go to producer at randycross.com. All right, let's go to a little happy trails. And if we're going to do happy trails, let's mess up a little food.
So what are you making, guys?
We're making some pie.
You're just going to put your whole foot in there? Okay.